Just drive, Finch. Your opinion on the protocol is as irrelevant as your presence.
Get us to the airfield, driver, and I will marry you. That is a formal diplomatic promise.
In the hallowed marble halls of the American Embassy, Tobias Toby Finch was nothing more than a ghost in a uniform. To Ambassador Catherine Blackwood, he was a functionary, a biological extension of the vehicle he drove, a man so insignificant she discussed top-secret treaty violations while he watched her through the rearview mirror. He was the invisible driver, a man whose dignity was stepped on daily by the heels of the political elite. But outside the iron gates, the city was screaming. A violent coup had ignited, and the very people Catherine had manipulated were now baying for her blood at the embassy doors. As the power went out and the elite security detail found themselves pinned down by RPG fire, the hierarchy of the embassy began to dissolve in the heat of the flames. In the shadows of the basement garage, the cold ambassador and the ignored driver are about to face a reality where titles mean nothing and raw courage means everything. This is the story of a man who was treated like furniture, and the woman who realized too late that he was the only wall standing between her and a firing squad. The hum of the armored sedan's engine was the only sound in the plush interior as Toby Finch adjusted the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at the traffic. He was watching Ambassador Catherine Blackwood. She was mid-sentence, her voice cold and precise, as she discussed a covert weapons shipment with her chief of staff. Toby caught her eye in the reflection, but she didn't look away or stop talking. To her, Toby was less than a person. He was merely a component of the car, as inanimate as the leather seats or the dashboard clock. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white, but his expression remained a mask of professional neutrality.
The treaty violation is a non-issue if the locals don't survive the winter, Catherine said, her tone dripping with calculated indifference. She didn't care that Toby heard every word, assuming a logistics coordinator with a driver's license lacked the intellect to understand the gravity of her treasonous maneuvers. Toby maneuvered the heavy vehicle through the crowded streets of the capital, his mind recording every detail of her conversation, while his eyes scanned for threats. He was a man of high intelligence hidden behind a low-level paycheck, a man who knew the city's pulse better than any diplomat ever could. Yet to the woman in the backseat, he was just Finch, a tool to be used and ignored. As they approached the embassy gates, the atmosphere in the city shifted from tense to volatile. Protesters were no longer just shouting, they were throwing stones, and the local police were nowhere to be found. Toby checked his side mirrors, noting the way the crowds were funneling toward the embassy's main entrance. "Ma'am, the north gate is compromised. I'm rerouting to the service tunnel," Toby said, his voice calm and steady. Catherine didn't even look up from her tablet, her face a picture of annoyance at the minor delay. "Just get me to the briefing, Finch. I don't pay you for tactical advice. I pay you to navigate." The insult stung, but Toby didn't let it show. He swung the heavy car into a narrow alleyway, narrowly missing a stray cart. Behind them, a distant explosion rattled the windows of the sedan, causing Catherine to finally drop her tablet. Her eyes widened as she looked back at the rising plumes of black smoke. For a fleeting second, the mask of the untouchable ambassador slipped, revealing a flicker of raw fear. Toby saw it in the mirror and felt a strange, bittersweet pang of empathy. Despite her cruelty, he was still the man responsible for her life, a duty he took with a seriousness she would never appreciate.
Suddenly, the embassy's radio comms crackled to life with a frantic burst of static and screaming. "All units, the perimeter is breached. The coup has begun. Repeat, the gates are down." The vehicle rocked as a secondary blast nearby sent a shockwave through the chassis. Catherine gripped the door handle, her knuckles matching Toby's in their paleness. "What is happening?" she demanded, her voice losing its icy edge and rising to a panicked tremor. Toby didn't answer immediately. He was too busy flooring the accelerator, the engine roaring as he forced the armored beast through a gathering crowd of armed rebels. They reached the service entrance just as a group of masked men began to spray the gate with gunfire. Bullets sparked against the sedan's reinforced glass, leaving white spiderweb cracks that obscured the view. Catherine let out a sharp gasp, ducking down into the footwell of the back seat. The invisible man was now the only thing standing between her and a violent mob. Toby handled the car with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, Jay turning the massive vehicle in a space that seemed far too small, his eyes locked on the narrow opening of the garage. Inside the embassy garage, the scene was one of total chaos. Marine guards were rushing to the upper levels, their faces grim under their helmets. Toby brought the car to a screeching halt and stepped out, opening the rear door for Catherine. She stumbled out, her expensive suit wrinkled, her hair falling out of its perfect bun. She looked at Toby, not as a driver, but as a lifeline, her breath coming in ragged hitches. For the first time in 3 years, she actually saw him. "Finch, what do we do?" she whispered, the coldness finally melting into a desperate need for direction. Toby stood tall, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the panicked soldiers and fleeing staff members around them. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a tactical radio he wasn't supposed to have. He looked the ambassador directly in the eyes, his gaze piercing and unafraid. "The Marines are focused on the front line, but they're being outflanked. If you stay here, you're a sitting duck," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete garage. Catherine looked around at her crumbling empire, then back at the man she had treated like furniture. If the world was ending, why was the driver the only one who seemed to have a plan? The heavy steel doors of the embassy garage groaned as the power grid flickered, plunging the concrete bunker into a rhythmic, pulsing emergency light. Catherine stood frozen, the silence of the basement magnified by the muffled thuds of mortar fire hitting the upper floors. She looked at Toby, waiting for him to resume his role as the silent servant. But the man before her had changed. He wasn't holding the door open. He was checking the seal on a side exit and monitoring a handheld scanner. "The main gates are gone, Catherine," he said, using her name for the first time without the shield of a title. She flinched, not at the informality, but at the chilling finality in his voice that signaled the old world was dead.
"You are overstepping, Finch," she tried to snap, but her voice betrayed her, cracking under the weight of a nearby tremor that sent dust raining from the ceiling. Toby didn't even turn around. He was busy pulling a map of the city's colonial-era sewer system from a hidden compartment in the garage wall. He had studied these routes for years, while she had been busy attending galas and signing death warrants with a fountain pen. He knew which tunnels flooded and which led to the safe houses of the resistance. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the red glow, looking more like a commander than a chauffeur. "My name is Toby, and if you want to live to see the sunrise, you'll stop acting like you're in a boardroom." The environmental pressure intensified as the smell of smoke began to seep through the ventilation shafts, thick and acrid. Above them, the sounds of heavy boots and breaking glass signaled that the militia had breached the secondary perimeter. Catherine's chief of security appeared at the top of the stairs, blood streaking his forehead, his eyes wide with the realization that they were outnumbered 10-1. He shouted for the ambassador to follow him to the rooftop helipad, but Toby stepped forward, blocking her path. "The rooftops are a kill zone," Toby stated flatly. "They have RPGs on the surrounding buildings. The air is closed." The security chief sneered, reaching for his holster to shove the lowly driver aside. Toby didn't flinch as the officer's hand gripped his shoulder. With a movement too fast for Catherine to fully track, Toby caught the man's wrist and applied a pressure point that forced the armed guard to his knees. It was a display of specialized training that no driver should have possessed. "I've spent 3 years driving you through these streets, watching the militia build their nests," Toby said to the groaning guard. "I know their firing lines. Do you?" The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that the hierarchy had inverted. The man they had ignored was the only one who had been paying attention to the reality of the war.
Catherine watched the interaction with a mixture of horror and sudden, sharp clarity. She remembered the classified briefing she had held in the back of Toby's car, the secrets of the treaty she thought were safe because the driver was invisible. She felt a cold sweat break across her neck as she realized he knew everything, her compromises, her coldness, and her true character. Yet here he was, protecting her while her hand-picked elite guards were failing. The social pressure of her position felt like a lead weight. She was the ambassador, but she was currently the most helpless person in the room. The garage door suddenly buckled inward, a massive dent appearing in the reinforced steel as a truck rammed it from the outside. The screams of the mob were now audible, a guttural roar of "Death to the traitor!" directed at Catherine. She retreated until her back hit the cold stone wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Toby moved toward her, not with a subservient bow, but with a protective stance that took up the space in front of her. He didn't look back at her. His focus was entirely on the buckling door. "They're coming for the treaty papers, aren't they?" Toby asked quietly, his voice devoid of judgment, only cold logic. Catherine could only nod, her eyes fixed on the sparks flying from the hinges. She had spent her career believing that people were chess pieces, and now she was the queen about to be captured. The very walls that were meant to protect her had become her cage. Toby reached out and grabbed a heavy tactical vest from a nearby locker, throwing it to her. "Put it on. The next 10 minutes will decide if you get a trial or a shallow grave." The bluntness of his words stripped away the last of her political facade, leaving her raw and terrified. She fumbled with the straps, her hands shaking uncontrollably. As the hinges of the garage door finally snapped, Toby drew a sidearm with a practiced ease that suggested his logistics coordinator title was a very thin veil for something much deeper. He looked at the chaos unfolding, and then at Catherine, who was struggling with the vest. He stepped closer, his hands steady as he tightened the straps for her, his face inches from hers. For a moment, the roar of the mob faded into the background as she looked into his bright, determined eyes. "Stay behind me," he commanded, the authority in his voice absolute. The driver was no longer following her lead. He was the only one capable of leading them out of the fire. The basement was now a tomb of smoke and shadows as Toby pulled Catherine through a narrow utility crawl space. Outside the heavy door they had just jammed, the sound of the militia's boots echoed like thunder against the concrete. Catherine stumbled, her designer heels snapping on the uneven floor, and she let out a muffled cry of frustration and pain. Toby didn't stop to offer a polite apology. He simply reached back, grabbed her hand with a grip like iron, and hauled her upright. The woman who had once demanded a 3-car escort just across the street was now being dragged through the dirt by a man she used to call Finch without looking him in the eye. They reached a small, reinforced monitoring room, where the embassy's internal cameras still flickered with ghostly images of the carnage above. Catherine collapsed into a chair, watching the screens as the militia ransacked her office, shredding the documents she had spent her life crafting. Her family's legacy, her political future, and her dignity were being burned in real time. She looked at her trembling hands, then at Toby, who was calmly reloading a magazine while staring at a map of the city's perimeter. "They're going to kill me, aren't they?" she whispered, the cold, calculating ambassador finally replaced by a terrified woman facing her own mortality. Toby paused, the click of the magazine the only sound in the room. He turned to look at her, not with the smugness of a man seeing his superior fall, but with a quiet, grounding intensity. "They want the woman on the posters, Catherine. They don't even know who you are," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He moved toward a locker and pulled out a plain, dark tactical jacket, tossing it to her. "Cover that suit. In this city, navy blue is a target. You need to be as invisible as I was." The irony of his words hit her like a physical blow.
a sharp reminder of how she had treated him as a ghost for years.
As she put on the jacket, a sudden explosion rocked the building, sending a shower of plaster over them. Catherine screamed, covering her head, but Toby didn't flinch. He stepped over her, shielding her body with his own, as the ceiling groaned. When the dust settled, she looked up and saw the back of his neck, scarred and tense, a physical barrier between her and the collapsing world. She realized then that he wasn't doing this because of his paycheck or his job description. He was doing it because of a code of honor she had long ago traded for political capital. Her heart, long frozen by ambition, felt a painful, confusing throb of genuine gratitude. The social pressure intensified when Toby's radio hissed with a transmission from the local militia leader, a man Catherine had once shared a formal dinner with. The leader was offering a bounty for her head, promising cleansing for the city once the American traitor was caught. Catherine felt a wave of nausea, realizing how many people she had alienated in her pursuit of the treaty. She looked at Toby, who was now checking the seal on a heavy canister of smoke grenades. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You could slip out. You know the streets. You don't have to die for me." Toby looked at her, his bright eyes searching hers in the dim emergency light. "I'm not dying for an ambassador," he said firmly. "I'm making sure a person gets home. There's a difference." This distinction, the idea that he valued her life as a human being more than her title, shook Catherine to her core. For years, she had surrounded herself with people who valued her power, but here was the man she had treated like dirt, the only one who saw her humanity. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his uniform, an unconscious gesture of connection she would have found unthinkable just hours before. The environmental pressure reached a breaking point as the thermal sensors on Toby's tablet turned bright red. The militia had found the service elevators and were heading down. "We have to move, now," Toby commanded, pulling her toward a heavy iron grate in the floor. As he pried it open, the sound of an oxyacetylene torch sparked against the room's main door. Catherine looked into the dark, damp hole of the drainage system, and then at Toby. She was terrified of the dark, of the filth, and of the unknown. But when she looked into his steady, baby-faced expression, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: trust. As they descended into the dark, Toby held the flashlight between his teeth, using both hands to guide her feet onto the rusted ladder rungs. Their faces were inches apart, the heat of the looming fire above and the damp chill of the tunnels below, creating a suffocating atmosphere. In that narrow space, the distance between an ambassador and a driver vanished completely. Catherine found herself clinging to his shoulders, her breath hitching as she realized that her life was literally in his hands. The man she had ignored was now her entire world, and the ice around her heart was finally beginning to crack under the weight of his quiet, unwavering strength. The darkness of the drainage tunnels was absolute, broken only by the thin, dancing beam of Toby's flashlight. Catherine stumbled through the knee-deep water, the stench of the city's underbelly clashing with the fading scent of her expensive perfume. Above them, the rhythmic thud of the militia's sledgehammers hitting the floorboards echoed like a heartbeat. Toby stopped suddenly, pressing Catherine against the wet brick wall as a group of rebels ran across a street grate just inches above their heads. He held his breath, his chest rising and falling against hers in the cramped space, and Catherine found herself mesmerized by the calm focus in his eyes despite the chaos. The social barrier had completely dissolved. Here, she was just a woman, and he was her protector. "The airfield is 3 miles east, but the main bridge is a blockade," Toby whispered, his voice vibrating against her shoulder. He pulled up a digital map, showing a sea of red dots, militia checkpoints, surrounding their only exit. Catherine looked at the map and then at Toby's soot-stained face, realizing that the odds were impossible. Her political mind, usually so sharp, could find no leverage, no deal to be struck with a mob that wanted her executed. She saw the weight of the situation settling on Toby's shoulders, the way he scanned the tunnel for any tactical advantage, and she felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for every time she had looked through him as if he didn't exist. They emerged into a derelict warehouse near the embassy perimeter, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and burning rubber. Toby moved with a predator's grace, clearing the corners of the room before beckoning her forward. In the center of the bay sat an old, up-armored diplomatic SUV, peppered with shrapnel marks, but seemingly functional. Toby began checking the engine, his hands moving with a frantic but precise energy. "If we take the back alleys, we can hit the first perimeter, but the final gate is a suicide run," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Catherine watched him, seeing not a driver, but a man of immense character who was willing to walk into a furnace for a woman who had never given him a kind word. The environmental pressure peaked as a flare hissed into the sky outside, bathing the warehouse in a ghoulish red light. A megaphone blared in the distance, calling for her surrender and promising a public reckoning. Catherine felt her knees give way, and she slumped against the cold metal of the SUV. The weight of her failures, the lives lost in the coup, and the certain death awaiting them outside crushed her spirit. She looked up at Toby, who was loading a heavy rifle he'd pulled from the vehicle's hidden rack. "Toby, stop," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through her diplomatic mask. "You've done enough. Just go. Save yourself while they're focused on this building." Toby dropped the rifle and crossed the floor in 2 long strides, kneeling in front of her. He took her shaking hands in his grip warm and steady. "I don't walk away from my post, Catherine. And I don't walk away from you," he said, his voice ringing with a sincerity that no politician could ever fake. Catherine looked into his eyes and saw a future she had never permitted herself to imagine. A life where she was valued for who she was, not the power she held. In that moment of absolute despair, she realized she couldn't lose him. She couldn't let this man be just another casualty of her cold world. A sudden, desperate thought seized her, a way to bind their fates together if they were to die, or to give him a reason to live if they survived. She grabbed his tactical vest, pulling him closer until their foreheads touched. Her voice was no longer that of an ambassador, but of a woman making the only honest deal of her life. "Toby, listen to me," she gasped, her eyes searching his. "Get us to the airfield, driver, and I will marry you. That is a formal diplomatic promise." It wasn't a bribe. It was a surrender of her heart, a recognition that the lowly man before her was the only one she ever wanted to stand beside. Toby froze, the gravity of her words hanging in the smoke-filled air. For a second, the baby-faced driver looked older, his expression shifting from surprise to a fierce, burning resolve. He didn't ask if she was joking or if it was the fear talking. He saw the truth in her tear-streaked eyes. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with a strength that felt like an anchor. "A diplomatic promise is a binding contract, Catherine," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. He turned back to the SUV with a renewed, almost terrifying intensity, his mind already calculating the velocity needed to break through the final blockade. He ushered her into the back of the SUV, surrounding her with Kevlar blankets and spare tires for extra shielding. As he climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roared to life, a defiant growl against the sirens outside. Toby checked his mirrors, his hands rock steady on the wheel, as he looked at Catherine through the rearview mirror, the same way he had for years, but now the connection was electric. "Stay low and don't look back," he commanded. The garage door creaked open, revealing a gauntlet of fire and steel. Toby shifted the car into gear, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to trade his life for her promise.
The armored SUV tore through the embassy gates like a bullet from a gun, the engine screaming as Toby pushed the vehicle to its absolute limit. Outside, the world was a blur of tracer rounds and orange fire, the tires shrieking as he drifted through narrow alleyways to avoid the primary militia patrols. Catherine lay huddled in the back, the sound of metal hitting metal deafening as Toby intentionally scraped against walls to maintain speed. She could see him in the reflection of the dashboard, a man transformed, his jaw set in stone, his hands dancing across the wheel with a mastery that defied the laws of physics. He was no longer a driver. He was a force of nature cutting through the heart of a revolution.
As they neared the airfield, the sight that met them was a nightmare of iron and fire. A massive blockade of heavy trucks and shipping containers, reinforced by a militia unit armed with RPGs. The road was a funnel, a kill zone designed to stop any escape, and Catherine felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she realized there was no way around it. Toby glanced at the thermal sensors, then back at the rear mirror, his eyes locking onto Catherine's for a fraction of a second. "The convoy is 5 minutes behind us, Catherine. If I don't clear this path, they'll pick you all off one by one," he said, his voice eerily calm amidst the carnage. She realized then that he wasn't planning on just driving through. He was planning on becoming the battering ram.
"Toby, no, there has to be another way," Catherine screamed, reaching out for him, but he had already engaged the manual locks. He reached into his vest, pulled out a small, battered photo of his mother, and tucked it into the sun visor, a silent goodbye that shattered Catherine's heart. He looked at the blockade and then at the speedometer, his face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard. "You made a promise, Catherine. Make sure you're there to keep it," he whispered. With a roar of defiance, Toby floored the accelerator, the SUV surging forward as the militia opened fire, a hail of lead bouncing off the reinforced hood.
The impact was a cataclysm of sound and light. Toby steered the vehicle directly into the weakest point of the blockade, a gap between two fuel trucks, aiming to create a breach for the following convoy. The world turned upside down for Catherine as the SUV crumpled, the airbags deploying in a white flash as the vehicle flipped over the wreckage of a truck. The sound of screeching metal and shattering glass filled her ears before a heavy, terrifying silence descended. Dazed and bleeding, Catherine kicked her way out of the side door, her eyes searching frantically through the smoke and fire for the driver's seat. The SUV was a mangled wreck, the front end flattened against the shipping container, and fire was beginning to lick at the ruptured fuel lines. Catherine crawled toward the driver's side, her hands burning on the hot asphalt, screaming Toby's name until her throat was raw. She found him slumped over the wheel, his face covered in blood, his breathing shallow and ragged. The invisible man was broken, his sacrifice the only reason the road was now clear for the approaching embassy convoy. As the militia retreated from the force of the explosion, Catherine pulled Toby's limp body from the wreckage, cradling his head in her lap as she wept openly, oblivious to the sirens of the rescue teams. Months later, the marble halls of the State Department were silent as Ambassador Catherine Blackwood stood before a televised hearing to address the Finch incident. The room was filled with high-ranking officials and cameras, everyone expecting a calculated political defense of her actions during the coup. Instead, Catherine looked at the podium and then at the back of the room, where a man in a simple suit sat in a wheelchair, his face still bearing the faint scars of his heroism. She didn't read from her prepared notes. She looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and filled with a new, unshakable dignity. "I have spent my life among politicians, generals, and kings," Catherine declared, her gaze never wavering from Toby's. "But I have only ever met one true diplomat, a man who understood that the highest form of service is not a signed treaty, but the willingness to bleed for another." She then stunned the nation by laying her diplomatic credentials on the table and resigning her post effective immediately. The social elite gasped, but Catherine didn't care about their judgment. She walked down from the dais, ignoring the reporters and the flashbulbs, and made her way to the back of the room. Toby watched her approach, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips as she reached him and took his hand. "You kept your promise," he whispered, his voice still a bit gravelly from the smoke inhalation. Catherine leaned down and kissed him, a gesture that signaled the end of her political life and the beginning of a real one. The driver had saved the ambassador,
but more importantly, Toby had saved Catherine from herself. As they left the building together, the man who was once treated like furniture walked and rolled into the sunlight as a hero, with the most powerful woman in the room proudly at his side.